Welcome to All About Capital Campaigns, a podcast that provides fuel for your nonprofit's growth. Each week, hosts Andrea Kilstedt and Amy Eisenstein, co-founders of the Capital Campaign Toolkit, provide practical tips about raising more money for your nonprofit organization. The Capital Campaign Toolkit is a support system for nonprofit leaders who are running capital campaigns. At capitalcampaigntoolkit.com, you can download a step-by-step guide for your capital campaign and get many other free resources. This podcast is usually recorded on a live webinar every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join the live sessions and get your questions answered by signing up today at toolkittalks.com. But this special summer edition is a conversation that Amy and Andrea thought you'd especially enjoy while the webinars are on the break until August 16th. Enjoy this special summer edition of this podcast.
All right. Welcome and hello, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Eisenstein. I am CEO and co-founder of the Capital Campaign Toolkit here in sunny central New Jersey. And I am today with my co-founder, Andrea Kilstedt, and we're going to introduce our guest in just a minute. Andrea, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Amy. Yes, I'm Andrea Kilstedt. I am a co-founder of Capital Campaign Toolkit, and I am calling in from the South Bronx in New York. I'm super happy to be here.
And today we are super excited to have one of the Capital Campaign Toolkit advisors with us as a guest. We have today Sarah Plimpton, who has joined us recently as an advisor for the Toolkit. Sarah, why don't you just take 30 seconds and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you both for having me today. It is a pleasure and a delight to be here. Sarah Plimpton, and I am calling in from Portland, Maine, where it is chilly at the moment. And let's see, I have been in the capital campaign business for about 20 years and have been intimately involved in many campaigns over that time frame. And I'm delighted to be with the Toolkit now.
Excellent. All right. So before we get to today's topic, I'm just going to share a little bit about the Capital Campaign Toolkit for anybody who's not familiar. We are a support system for nonprofit leaders running capital campaigns, and we would love to help you with your campaign. If you are thinking about or getting ready or planning for a campaign, please go ahead and visit the Capital Campaign Toolkit website, where we have tons of free resources and opportunities to sign up to speak to one of our experts to answer any of your campaign-related questions. All right, so today we are going to be talking about delighting and managing volunteers. Andrea, why don't you kick us off and get you and Sarah started on the topic?
Yes, I love this topic of delighting and managing volunteers. In fact, I love the idea of delighting people, right? I love the idea of delighting partners and friends and children. I mean, it's a skill that the better we get at it more broadly, right, the better life goes. And it's also true, I think, of capital campaigns, that effectively designed capital campaigns use and involve a lot of people as volunteers. And it is super important that they feel good about doing that. Now, Sarah's had a lot of campaign experience, both as a consultant and inside organizations. So she is intimately familiar with the process and the magic of delighting volunteers. Sarah, why don't you tell us about your experience?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic. And, I think in campaigns, there's often a tendency to think about delighting donors, which is obviously very important and something we do need to be thinking about. But there's also great utility in thinking about delighting volunteers, because they are oftentimes the best vehicle by which we can deepen relationships with donors. So I think about, I'll tell a story about a campaign that I worked on where the campaign prior to the one that I was working on, which had happened maybe 7 or 8 years before I was involved in this organization. This campaign that had happened many years ago met its goal. So it hit its, sort of top line objective. But it took 7 or 8 years to get there, and volunteers were tired at the end of that campaign.
Yeah, that's a long campaign. We try and get people to wrap up in 3 years for that very reason. It's a long time to have volunteers working on something for 7 or 8 years, right?
Yeah, very long time. And there had been sort of, lots of valleys, shall we say, in that 7 or 8 years, right? There were a lot of times when things weren't going so well and there wasn't a plan and volunteers weren't, tasked well. So fast forward another 7 or 8 years, that campaign is in the rearview mirror. And I was involved with this organization, helping them get ready for the next thing. And when we started, it was fascinating to encounter the institutional memory of that experience 7 or 8 years ago. And it lasted, right? There was sort of this, fundraising is so hard and we don't really want to do it. And campaigns are awful. And, sort of this just hesitation to be involved in campaigning, which made starting that next campaign that much harder. And for me, made me really feel like we have to get to the end of this campaign. And as a sub goal, we need volunteers to feel the exact opposite. Excited about what they've just helped us accomplish, enthusiastic about fundraising, willing to do more, not exhausted.
Yeah. So Sarah, tell us, how did you do it?
Well, I don't know that I did it single-handedly, but I really tried at every step of that campaign to think about what is the experience of each volunteer working with my office.
So Sarah, give us some specific examples of that.
Yeah. So, thinking about, you have your first committee meetings, right? And I could tell that some of my volunteers were terrified of fundraising, loved the mission of the organization, believed in the campaign and believed in its goals and outcomes, but were really wary of fundraising, right? And I knew that I needed to spend a little bit more time with some of those volunteers. I needed to manage each volunteer differently, right? Some people were raring to go, had solicitation experience under their belt from past efforts elsewhere. And I needed to give those volunteers different things than I needed to give some of the volunteers who were a little bit more skeptical. So I think really meeting each volunteer where they are in any given moment. I think about, staffing volunteers, which takes so much time and so much, sort of attention to detail, but really pays off, right? So a committee meeting would end and I would make it a point to have the next day and a half on my calendar cleared so that I could be writing follow-up notes for each volunteer, giving them talking points for their assignments, making sure that within 24 or 36 hours, I was giving to each volunteer, here's your list of people that we've discussed and we have a strategy for. Here's a recap of what that strategy is. Here's their phone number, their email address, and here are some talking points.
Yeah, I think it is really about providing volunteers with the tools that they need to be successful and not making an assumption that they know what they're doing or they know how to do it. And it is a ton of work on the side of the staff. But the more you can prepare your volunteers in advance and after the fact, after a meeting, before meetings, the better it will go. And then, really leverage your campaign because you've got so many more people working on it. Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think all of this is really good and a great thing for everyone to keep in mind, right? What are the things you need to do in order to facilitate every volunteer so that they can do their job successfully and in the best way possible. And I think, Sarah, you point to the details and the specific things that you can do in order to make that happen. I think about delighting people in a slightly different way, which isn't to say that it is replaces it. I think in addition, and that is that I think that people are generally delighted when they think someone has actually seen them and has noticed what they have done well. And, as Amy knows that I really believe in that as a strategy for life. It's very easy to notice people when they've done something bad, right, or not done it well. But we tend to let go when people do things well. We tend not to call that out, right? It's easy to call out negative stuff, harder to call out, or takes more attention to call out positive stuff. And my experience is that if you or anyone involved in the campaign gets in the habit of noticing and calling out the good stuff, right? That, gee, Jill, I saw that you made all your calls in a remarkably short period of time, right? That really sets the standard for us. Thank you so much for doing that, right? Even all she did was to do what she said she was going to do, right? She's going to feel special. She's going to feel like she was treated really well. Sometimes in the Capital Campaign Toolkit, we actually spend a lot of time thinking about how to delight our members. And periodically we really do, right? We send them things. Recently we sent a couple of members little boxes of Godiva chocolates because we had one client that all of a sudden had a really big gift after a very difficult period in her campaign, right? And we sent her some goodies, right? She was totally bowled over, right? Because it was unexpected. Mm-hmm. So I guess the other thing I'd touch on, then I pass it back to you, is the notion that when things are unexpected, they are delightful, right? That it's one thing to get a pro forma thank you, right? Thank you for so much for your help with the Capital Campaign, or thank you for going to solicit so-and-so. But when you get something that is not what you expected, it has a little more air of delight and excitement to it.
So Sarah, what are some other tips and tricks that you use for managing volunteers or delighting volunteers?
Yeah, I think, Andrea, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think that is spot on. I think that every once in a while, write a handwritten note to your volunteers, just saying, we wouldn't be where we are toward the goal of this campaign without you. And, to your point, Andrea, call out something great that they've done or that they're working hard on. Those things really, really do matter and make a difference. And I think, when people feel like you see their effort and appreciate their effort, they're that much more willing to keep going and give more and do more, take on more than they perhaps might have imagined they would take on. One of the things that I loved by the end of that campaign that that I started out referencing was some of the volunteers who I began the campaign with, by the end of it were sort of almost running at my speed in terms of strategy, and we could almost speak to each other in shorthand, where, you sort of don't need to hold people's hands quite as much because you've supported them so well. They start to think like fundraisers in a different way, which I think is really what you want. And they feel quite empowered to think and act that way, which is lovely.
Right. This conversation has brought me back to a remarkable story about delighting volunteers. Years ago, I worked on a hospital campaign, and the one of the co-chairs was a remarkable woman who had been a nurse and had been involved in that hospital for a great many years, and she really took the bit for this campaign. I mean, she worked tirelessly for a long time, making the campaign successful. I don't know how many, 2 or 3 years. She would solicit gifts, and she would be dogged and determined, and I mean, everything you would hope for in a volunteer. And at the end of the campaign, I mean, which was very successful, the board, I think with the encouragement of the development director, wanted to do something special for her, to make her feel special, her and her husband. So the board took up a collection from among them to raise money to send them on an all-expense-paid trip to Italy, where they had always wanted to go.
Wow.
And that's what they did. They presented it to her at a meeting. She knew nothing about it, right? I don't know, it was a 10-day all-expense-paid trip to Italy.
All right. So that's an extreme example. We don't have to come up with examples like that. Not everybody's going to do that. But let's talk about things that you can do. A 10-day trip to Italy sounds heavenly, but let's talk about things that are probably more realistic, more practical, more cost-effective, in ways that you can still delight and inspire and genuinely thank your donors.
But Amy, let's not dismiss that so quickly, because there's actually some profound I mean, that isn't going to happen with every campaign. I got that. But the effect of it was that every board member who gave to make that trip possible felt great and special and excited to have been part of this campaign, and excited to be part of recognizing what this woman and with everyone else had achieved. So while it maybe feel like an outlier, the reality is that if you get other people involved in thanking and acknowledging and making other people feel special, they feel special too.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not to be dismissed. It is extreme for sure, but it has some powerful lessons in it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I've on some campaigns that I've run it at sort of transition points in the campaign, phasing, when we've finished, the quiet phase or the leadership gift phase, and we're kind of moving down the gift chart. If it's sort of appropriate, culturally, I've had sort of small little events for our leadership where, it's not a donor event. It's just for the leadership of the campaign at that juncture, where we might have a catered lunch and, instead of an all business campaign meeting, we might have like a catered lunch, social time with each other. The executive director or CEO might say, you all are working so hard for us. We are so grateful. We've made a ton of progress. We wouldn't be here without you. There's a lot of work still to come. We're taking this moment mid-campaign to pause, to celebrate internally, as a group of leaders, what we've accomplished, and to just take a breath right now. And that has really been a lovely thing to do, to not be go the whole way through.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, is to chop up your campaign into milestones and really celebrate as you accomplish each milestone. Because if you do wait to the end of the campaign to celebrate, you're going to be waiting a couple years in most cases. And so, I think that's a really good point. I like to celebrate accomplishments big and small. So whether it's somebody, as Andrea mentioned, made some thank you calls or wrote some thank you notes, or, and of course, scale the celebration based on what the accomplishment is. But if you have a volunteer who successfully asked for their first gift, you had better celebrate that and acknowledge that. And you want to be careful if you're acknowledging every single thing. It probably will get to the point where it sounds disingenuous. So pick and choose. But I think it is so important to acknowledge both as a group and individually. And really, the more specific you can be in terms of what you're grateful for and thankful for, I think the more effective and powerful it is. When you say to a whole group, we couldn't do this without you, that's true. It's wonderful. But if you can pinpoint specific things that each member has done, it becomes even more effective because they know that you've taken the time to think about them in a personal and specific way. Mm-hmm. Good.
There are a couple of other things that come to my mind about this topic. One of them is really quite simple and I think underused, and that is that people are often delighted when they are in the know before other people. That sharing information early, right? Confidential information, or clearly information that can be shared, but information before it is public knowledge, before it's even known by the broader committee, right, makes people feel delighted that you would take the time to email me or call me and say, I thought you might like to know that this gift just came in, right? And it's so exciting. Here's what it has done. Just a call like that makes people feel like you thought about them. You saw them. They are insiders. We all like to be insiders. So, I think people who are running volunteers, who are working with volunteers, should keep a list, right? An easy to access list of people that they might want to give early information to. And they should scan that list and say, well, who should I be telling about this now? Right? And it's very easy to forget to do that because you're in the heat of everything else. Mm-hmm. It's very simple, but I think remarkably powerful. In a surprise sort of way.
Sarah, do you have another example of
what you just brought up for me, Andrea? I love that point you just made. People also like to be successful, right? Success feels good. Mm-hmm. So
yes.
Are we being really deliberate and thoughtful about setting our volunteers up for success, right? So you have a new, excited, but perhaps a little bit timid fundraiser. This might sound obvious, but don't give them for their first assignment a bulldog donor, yes. Right? Let's give them a couple wins early on, because that is going to make them feel good.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so important.
A good point. Yes, I was just saying to someone, they were asking me, not for a campaign specifically, but for just general major gift fundraising. They said, who should I start with? I said, start with people that are going to say yes, right? So same thing with your volunteers. Don't set them up for failure. Why would they ever want to do it again if they don't get the first gift? So, yes, Sarah, I love that point. Make sure that they are set up for success.
And I also think that it applies, that's a very micro example, right? On a prospect level, but on a macro standpoint, it also applies in that, and I think that the toolkit does this brilliantly, not having one campaign committee that is a monolith that runs through the whole campaign, where when you recruit, you're asking people to commit for 2 years or 3 years of their life. That is a bear of a commitment, right? But rather stacking your campaign committees as a series of shorter, tighter, more focused bodies, where you may end up having a good handful of people that cycle through every single one of those committees, but you're preserving them, right? Yeah. You can make a choice to let the people go who've kind of expended the energy they're going to expend on your campaign, and you can do so happily. They can walk off happily, having done the thing you asked them to do in a short chunk. Or you can also re-recruit somebody who still has gas in the tank.
Yeah, I think that really works so well when you think about using volunteers that way for short-term specific assignments. and then thanking them and celebrating them. I mean, actually, the end of every committee you can use it for a mini celebration.
Totally.
Right? If you're together, you can have some bubbly. You can actually go around the table and talk about what everybody did. I mean, I'm a big fan of funny awards. Now, I know not everybody does that, and it actually takes a fair amount of work to do it and to do it well. But I have several times in my career actually encouraged people and seen the idea of funny awards work. So, where you look carefully at what someone has accomplished, and then you come up with a funny award, the Marilyn Monroe Award for the most glamorous solicitor who has, raised money for so-and-so, or you can, if you have some creative people to think about that, you can actually create little art awards, little awards, and people, it has a particular resonance to it when it is creative, as opposed to just an official plaque, right? When somebody has really noticed what you've done and come up with something that captures that as a special award. But it takes the right collection of people who have that kind of creativity. Mm-hmm. But I've seen it work wonderfully well.
I think as a default, if you can connect the mission with the thank you, it's always a nice touch. I've worked with a soup kitchen that also has a culinary school that's training people for on-the-job training. And they send during cookie week, when they're teaching people to make cookies, oh boy, every donor gets a batch of cookies. And let me tell you something, or volunteers get cookies. And that is special because the participants in the program have just learned to make them. And it connects it to the mission. And so if there's a way to connect your gratitude to the mission, I think it's also a lovely touch.
Yeah, I have another great example of that was incredibly successful. Actually, that there was a daycare center that was having a campaign, and they actually took kids' art and framed it, right, with a little plaque on the bottom of it. And they, in some cases, they took kids' art and they made cards out of them. Right. So the front was a small piece of art done by the kids, and then they mounted it on a card. Right. So, and it was real. It wasn't printed. It was, and that sort of, with a little note about whoever the child was who had done it in some cases, it brought it right back to the mission. It was very effective.
I have a couple other thoughts as well. I love this discussion, by the way. So fun to be thinking about all of this. I think also about checking in with volunteers when you don't necessarily need something,
right,
just to see how they're doing.
Yeah, wonderful idea. I think that's, again, something that we should be doing more of just as individualism.
Yeah. And then another thought. Oh, go ahead, Andrea. Were you going to?
No, I'm done.
I also am a big fan of asking for feedback at various points. And just saying, my goal is to support you really well and to make this a great campaign experience for you. How am I doing? Are there things that I could be doing differently or better to help you or to make this an even more delightful experience for you?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that people remember endings. People, right, we tend to remember the way things end. We remember the high point, the high emotional point of the meeting, whatever that was. Sometimes it's a good high emotional point. Sometimes it's a big blow up, right? And then we remember how something ends. So I think we can delight people by doing a better job of endings, of the way we end individual meetings, and more importantly, the way the volunteer ends their involvement with that campaign, right? The more we carefully think about that, and the more we really, use that to make the volunteer feel great. If the first campaign you talked about, Sarah, had done that at the end, even if it had been a problematic campaign, if they had really taken care of volunteers at the end, you probably would have had less challenge when you tried to re-engage them.
Absolutely. And I also think we perhaps might have raised more money in that subsequent campaign.
It's interesting.
Which is a bold statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think to your point, Sarah, our volunteers are likely among your pool of biggest and most loyal donors. Mm-hmm. So to keep them delighted and happy, and they are going to give more. And so, the vast majority of your volunteers in a campaign are going to be your significant donors. So we have to do a good job, both because they're volunteers and because they're donors. All right, let's start to wrap up. Let's think about final thoughts, words of wisdom. Sarah, do you have any final words of wisdom you want to leave listeners with?
I think I said this at the beginning. If I didn't, I should have. But this is what I would emphasize. At every step of your campaign process and at every step of engaging volunteers, think about their experience of the engagement. How are they feeling when they come to the committee meeting, when they go through the committee meeting, when the committee meeting ends, when they go on their first solicitation, and use that reflection to guide you in fortifying those volunteer relationships.
Yeah, I think that's a great parting thoughts. Put yourself in your volunteers' shoes for a day and see what's going on with them. What are their fears? What are their worries? What are their questions? Andrea, what about your final thoughts?
Yeah. So my final thought is this: you will know that you have done a really good job with volunteers, particularly volunteers who serve on a committee, when they don't want the committee assignment to end. That's the test, right? If they say, no, we want to keep coming together, then you know that they've had a great time.
Yes, it's social as well. They should be getting things out of it, emotionally, socially, as well as, giving back. As much as they're giving back, volunteers always say they get more. So think about what are you able to give or provide for your volunteers? I think that's so, and so that they want to keep coming back and being a volunteer for the months and years ahead.
Yeah, so I have one more thing to say, which is everybody who's listening to this session, I encourage you to get off the session, pick up a piece of paper and pen, or open a document on your computer and write down as many things as you can think of that you could do to delight your volunteers. Just write them down one after another. See if you can come up with 50. You may surprise yourself. And that'll set you up for doing a good job with your volunteers.
Excellent. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. We just loved having your wisdom and your experience with working with volunteers.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Bye, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining Amy and Andrea for today's All About Capital Campaigns. To learn more about them and their work together, go to capitalcampaigntoolkit.com.